100 hours of ground combat. 3,300 Iraqi tanks destroyed. The coalition lost 0 to enemy fire. August 2nd, 1990. The desert silence broke. 700 Iraqi tanks ignited their engines at once. The low roar of 700 heavy diesels vibrated through the sand. 100,000 soldiers crossed the border in a single night. Steel columns moved through the darkness, cutting into Kuwait like a blade. In 48 hours, the country fell. Saddam Hussein commanded the 5th largest army on earth. His forces numbered nearly 1 million men. They operated 5,000 tanks. This single fleet was larger than the combined active armor of Great Britain, France, and Germany. The Iraqi High Command did not rely on machines alone. They banked on the men inside them. The army was split in two. On one side stood the conscripts, on the other, the Republican Guard. These were not forced recruits, they were volunteers, Saddam's elite. These men carried the weight of 8 years of combat. The Iran-Iraq War had been their forge. It cost nearly 1 million lives. This decade of slaughter carved a single survival instinct into the minds of every veteran: dig in. Experience became a cage. In the marshes of the Iranian border, they had mastered static defense, trench warfare, long, bloody stalemates where the winner was the one who stayed behind the thickest wall of earth. The Republican Guard brought this logic to the open desert. They viewed the vast sands not as a space for maneuver, but as a giant trench. Their elite status was undeniable. Their combat record was extensive. Yet their tactics belonged to a dead era. While the world's most advanced kinetic force prepared to strike, the Iraqis chose to wait. They buried their tanks deep into the sand. While Iraqi divisions dug into the sand, the response was gathering speed. 39 nations joined Operation Desert Shield. It was the largest American deployment since the Vietnam War. 670,000 soldiers moved toward the border. Imagine moving the entire population of Boston to the other side of the planet. The Americans brought 3,000 tanks. Most crews had spent their careers in the damp forests of West Germany. They lived for one scenario: a Soviet breakthrough at the Fulda Gap. What were they preparing for in the woods of Europe? To kill the T-72. Now, they were facing that exact machine in the dust of the Middle East. The transition was a physical shock. On the bases in Saudi Arabia, the olive drab of NATO disappeared. Maintenance crews worked in the heat. They sprayed fresh tan pigment over the green and black patterns. The air hung heavy. The sharp chemical scent of wet desert paint scorched on blistering armor. This thin layer of color was the only thing hiding the NATO standard from the sun. The threat remained the same, but the scale was different. The Iraqis held the 5th largest army on earth. Their T-72 tanks carried the most powerful gun NATO had ever encountered. It was the feared 125mm smoothbore cannon. The survival of these crews depended on depleted uranium armor and a revolutionary internal architecture. At its core, the Abrams was a fortress of density. The engineers layered steel-encased depleted uranium over a classified Chobham-type composite. Depleted uranium is 1.6 times denser than lead. It is 2.5 times denser than steel. This material transformed the turret into a monolithic shield, making it significantly harder to penetrate than any Soviet equivalent. But the true genius lay not in how the tank took a hit, but in how it handled a breach. What happens when a shell finally pierces the armor? In an Abrams, the ammunition sits in a reinforced compartment at the rear. Heavy steel blast doors separate the shells from the soldiers. You can hear the dull metallic clang of the door sliding shut, sealing the crew in a separate world. If the ammunition cooks off, the energy must go somewhere. The tank is designed to fail safely. Special blowout panels on the roof are the weakest point by design. When the propellant ignites, the explosion punches through these panels and vents upward into the sky. The blast moves out and away. The thick internal door holds firm against the pressure. The turret remains attached to the hull. Even in a catastrophic fire, the crew had a chance. Iraqi T-72 crews operated in a different reality. The commander and gunner did not sit behind armor. They sat directly on top of their own destruction. Beneath their boots lay the autoloader carousel. It held bags filled with a volatile powder mixture. These were the propellant charges for the two-piece ammunition, 400 kilograms of raw explosive energy. No steel doors separated the men from the fire. What happens if a spark hits the autoloader carousel? The 400 kilograms of propellant detonate instantly. A single penetration by a kinetic sabot starts a chain reaction. The internal pressure peaks in milliseconds. A blinding white flash fills the cramped fighting compartment. The air turns into a solid wall of fire. The T-72 turret weighs 12 tons. That is the weight of a full-size school bus. Yet the force of the internal blast is so violent, it tosses this mass 30 meters into the air. This design flaw turned every Iraqi tank into a preloaded coffin. When the ammunition ignited, it did not just destroy the machine, it erased the humans inside. The coalition did not simply send an army. They relocated a steel industrial zone into the heart of the desert. Against the Iraqi machines, the High Command unleashed an armada of 1,956 M1A1 Abrams tanks and 221 British Challenger ones. Dust clouds choked the horizon. Endless columns of tracked vehicles stretched for miles, turning the sand into a fine, choking powder. Logistics became a nightmare of scale. 1,200 of these Abrams tanks were the heavy variants. Inside their hulls lay layers of depleted uranium mesh. This was high-density armor designed to shatter incoming kinetic rounds. It was the first time such technology saw mass deployment. The Americans also brought 277 aging M60 patterns to fill the gaps. Britain added its own weight. Their deployment of 221 Challengers was the largest British armored force seen since 1945. It was a mobilization of sheer mass. Alongside the heavy armor, 2,200 Bradley fighting vehicles moved into position. The real power of those 1,956 Abrams lay in their optics. These systems redefined the reality of the battlefield. How do you fight in a midnight sandstorm? Thermal imagers made the enemy visible through solid walls of dust. On the gunner screens, a dull greenish glow revealed the heat signatures of Iraqi T-70s. They appeared as bright, clean ghosts against the cold desert floor. The Iraqis saw nothing but gray static. The Americans saw every detail of their prey. The advantage was mathematical. For a tank in World War II, hitting a target a kilometer away required 3 to 5 ranging shots. The Abrams changed the equation. It delivered a 95% hit probability with the very first round. This wasn't luck. A laser rangefinder measured the gap between hunter and victim with a margin of error of only 10 meters. The fire control computer processed wind, cant, and distance instantly. It turned a 2,500-meter shot into a routine task. 10 meters. The digital precision of the laser rangefinder met its match in the steel of the M829A1. Tankers called it the silver bullet. This was the final word in the 120mm smoothbore gun's vocabulary. The loader slams the shell into the breech. A pull of the trigger ignites the propellant. The sabot pedals peel away in mid-air, leaving a 4.6-kilogram depleted uranium dart screaming across the dunes. Its speed is 1,500 meters per second. That is Mach 4.4. The projectile covers the distance so fast that the target is destroyed before the supersonic crack of the shot even reaches it. How does it ignore Soviet armor? The secret lies in the physics of uranium. Most penetrators flatten out like a mushroom upon impact. Uranium does the opposite. It is self-sharpening. As it punches through the hull, the edges of the rod slough off, maintaining a needle-sharp point that never loses its bite. At a distance of 2,000 meters, the silver bullet pierces 570 millimeters of solid rolled steel. Its trajectory is almost perfectly flat out to 3,600 meters. The T-72 had no answer for this kinetic monster. During one engagement, a single American round passed through a sand berm, perforated an Iraqi tank, exited the rear, and destroyed a second T-72 standing behind it. 90,000 tons of aerial bombs fell on the positions of Iraqi conscripts before the first coalition tank even crossed the border. 6 weeks of relentless fire from above. The Iraqi army didn't just lose equipment, it lost the will to exist. How does an army survive without supplies under fire from the sky? It ceases to be an army. A low, rhythmic hum filled the desert air. It was the sound of B-52 bombers. They stayed high, invisible, and methodical. Below them, Iraqi soldiers sat in narrow trenches. They clutched their rifles and stared at the horizon, waiting for a ground assault that never came. Instead, the earth simply erupted. The scale was mathematical. 100,000 sorties, 90,000 tons of explosives. This was the equivalent of 4 atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki. Supply lines snapped. Food ran out. Water became a luxury. Soldiers sat in the sand, isolated and starving, watching their armor turn into scrap metal before they could even start the engines. A-10 Warthogs and Apache helicopters hunted anything that moved. The physical toll was immense. The psychological toll was absolute. By the time the ground phase began, the Iraqi forward units were hollow shells. The air campaign alone destroyed 900 tanks. Those who survived 6 weeks of relentless bombardment faced a final, logical choice. They chose life. When coalition ground forces finally crossed the border, they didn't find a wall of fire. They found a human tide moving in the opposite direction. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers emerged from the sand. Their eyes were hollow. Their uniforms were rags. They walked with hands raised, silhouettes against the desert horizon, surrendering on a scale that shocked the planners in Washington. Marines processed nearly 10,000 prisoners on the first day alone. Within 48 hours, the count hit 26,000. The frontline units had simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. They were starving, broken, and finished with the war. But the regular army's collapse was only the first layer. Deep in the desert, the Republican Guard remained. They were dug in, well-equipped, and waiting. On the afternoon of February 26th, a small spearhead moved east to find them. This was Eagle Troop. The unit consisted of 130 soldiers, 12 M3 Bradleys, 2 mortars, and 9 M1A1 Abrams tanks. Most of the 26,000 prisoners were ordinary conscripts. They were not elite. They were the ones tasked with holding the desert line in outdated metal boxes. What could crews expect when their guns failed after 120 shots? Nothing. A loader shoved a steel kinetic penetrator into the breach. The metal clanged against the cramped turret wall of a Type 69 tank. This shell was Soviet surplus, withdrawn from their frontline service in 1973. It could pierce 250 millimeters of armor. The Abrams hull faced them with 800 millimeters of composite steel. The math of the duel was simple. Survival was impossible. The Iraqi gun barrels were exhausted. The factory limit was 120 rounds. After that, accuracy vanished. Many of these tanks had served for years as indirect artillery in previous conflicts. The rifling was gone. The steel was warped. The bulk of the force relied on the Chinese Type 69 and the Soviet T-55. These were evolutions of a 1950s design. To the modern M1A1, they were rolling relics. The men inside were not the battle-hardened Republican Guard. They were poorly trained boys in beaten-up machines. They sat in the forward positions, waiting for the first strike. The Iraqi command sent these raw crews to the front lines. Elite units did not surrender. They stayed in their pits, trusting the fixed steel of their T-72 M1 tanks. 1,000 of these machines formed the backbone of the Republican Guard. On paper, they were the pride of Soviet engineering. In reality, they were a geopolitical deception. The Kremlin sold a myth. The T-72 M1 was an export variant. Every critical component was downgraded. Soviet engineers stripped the ceramic rod inserts from the armor. They replaced advanced composite layers with simple steel. They packed the racks with outdated ammunition. Moscow refused to share its cutting-edge secrets with foreign clients. Even allies received hollow shells. Was the Soviet tank truly a failure? The U.S. Army later admitted the truth. The myth of garbage Soviet armor was born in the Iraqi desert. Western observers judged an entire empire by these crippled machines. A genuine T-72 in the hands of a Soviet crew was a different animal. It was faster, tougher, and far more lethal. But the Iraqis didn't have those. They had the monkey model. This gap in technology cost thousands of lives. The Soviets kept the real technology for themselves. Iraqi crews faced more than just weakened armor. They faced absolute blindness in the night desert. The darkness was a trap. Iraqi gunners relied on outdated infrared searchlights. They flicked the switch. A massive beam of invisible light cut through the blackness. To the naked eye, nothing changed. But on the American thermal screens, a star was born. The searchlight became a beacon. It screamed the tank's position across kilometers of sand, a direct invitation for a kill shot. The Americans didn't need lights. The Abrams used a passive thermal system. It emitted nothing. It detected everything. In the thickest dust and oily smoke, the M1A1 saw heat signatures like glowing ghosts. Why did Iraqi crews fix their sights at 1,800 meters? Combat stress. The analog ballistic computers were too complex. They were unreliable. Commanders ordered a default battle sight range of 1,800 meters to simplify the chaos. Anything beyond that distance was a gamble. The Abrams, meanwhile, could kill from over 3,000 meters. It was a firing range, not a battle. Even at close range, the Iraqi steel failed. During one engagement, a T-72 scored a direct hit on an Abrams from only 400 meters. The crew watched the tracer impact the front plate. There was a spark and a roar. The 125mm shell simply bounced off. While Iraqi scouts squinted at the southern horizon, American crews began their march from the west. The date was February 24, 1991. The plan was a massive flanking maneuver, a Hail Mary across a 300-mile front. The Iraqi army was blind. Airstrikes had wiped out their reconnaissance. Their jets had fled to Iran or lay in charred ruins. They had no way to see the storm breaking on their right flank. For the American tank crews, the war began as a surreal green-tinted blur. They drove straight into a desert sandstorm. Visibility for the naked eye dropped to zero. You could not see the tank driving 10 yards beside you. The commander stared into the thermal sights. The driver watched the early military GPS receiver. In the howling wind and dust, the only reality was the glow of the instruments. The air inside the Abrams grew foul, stale, heavy with the scent of sweat, hydraulic fluid, and diesel. The crews did not leave their machines. For 100 hours straight, they remained sealed inside the steel hulls. Was there any relief? None. They ate, slept, and even used the bathroom without opening the hatches. The pace was relentless. The tanks pushed through the open desert at 15 kilometers per hour. It was a slow crawl on paper, but a lightning strike in the sand. They moved faster than the Iraqis could react, and faster than their own supplies could travel. The Abrams is a hungry beast. Its turbine engine burns 8 gallons of fuel for every single mile. The heavy fuel trucks struggled to keep pace across the shifting dunes. Armored columns were forced to grind to a halt. Commanders watched their gauges hit the quarter tank mark and waited. The advance of the world's most powerful army stopped and started based on the arrival of the next tanker. 8 gallons per mile. The American tanks emerged from the storm. The only obstacle in their path was a brigade led by a man known as Major Muhammad. He was no amateur. Muhammad was a graduate of the United States Army Infantry Officer Advanced Course at Fort Benning. He had been trained by the Americans themselves. His defense followed their own textbook. Why did Muhammad's perfect defense fail? He positioned 40 dug-in tanks and 16 BMPs behind an imperceptible rise in the terrain. This was a classic reverse slope defense. He created 2 kill zones exactly 1,000 yards east of the ridgeline. The plan was simple. Catch the Americans as they crested the rise, exposing their weaker top armor. Hundreds of infantry filled the bunkers and trenches. 18 T-72 tanks waited in reserve 3,000 meters further east. Muhammad did everything right, but he was fighting a ghost. His reconnaissance vehicles had been destroyed days earlier. The sandstorm blinded his remaining observers. He had no warning. Crucially, he did not know about the global positioning system. GPS allowed the Americans to ignore the maps of the past. Muhammad assumed the enemy would follow the established roads. He oriented his entire defense facing south. But at 16:07 hours, the Americans struck from the west. By midnight on February 26th, the battlefield had vanished into a toxic cloud of burning oil. The sky was a lid of heavy overcast and rain. Below it, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, began its passage through the lines of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. Vision died. How do you fight when your eyes are useless? The crews moved into a world of green screens. The air was a thick, oily sludge. It tasted of sulfur and raw petroleum. To the naked eye, the world was a black void ripped apart by streaks of tracer fire and the orange glare of exploding steel. Identification was impossible. Only thermal sights like the ANVSG-2 could cut through the haze. These sensors tracked heat, mapping differences in temperature down to a fraction of a degree. But the technology had a lethal blind spot. An Iraqi tank with a cold, dead engine was invisible. It held the same temperature as the desert sand. Coalition armor rolled past these silent iron ghosts. They were just dark shapes on the edge of the screen, indistinguishable from rocks. Then, the Iraqi crews scrambled from their bunkers. They climbed into the cold steel. They threw the ignition switches. A spark, a roar, and a glowing heat signature suddenly screamed into existence in the middle of the American formation. The front line dissolved. It became a battle of 360 degrees. Tanks fired in every direction at once. Iraqi infantry crawled out of burning BMPs, refusing to surrender. They swarmed the American vehicles on foot, physically clawing at the hulls to find a gap. Iraqi fighters waited in depressions, jumping up with RPG launchers to strike the thin rear armor as the tanks passed. Iraqi infantry physically roared around the hulls of the machines. Those same thermal imagers that saved crews in the midnight chaos turned the war into a one-sided shooting gallery the following day. The Iraqi defense at Medina Ridge was tactically perfect. On February 27th, the Medina Division of the Republican Guard dug in behind a low rise stretching 7 miles. They utilized a classic reverse-slope defense. T-72s and Type 69s sat in deep berms with only their turrets exposed. To any observer approaching from the west, the desert looked empty. But technology made the earth transparent. American gunners stared at glowing green monitors. Through the dirt and brush, they saw the jagged heat signatures of engines and hulls. The camouflage was useless. At 5 kilometers, the resolution was so sharp that Abrams crews could see the heat of a urine stream from an Iraqi soldier relieving himself in the bushes. The Iraqis saw nothing but the horizon. Can a soldier fight an invisible enemy? Colonel Montgomery Meigs and the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division opened fire from distances the Iraqis couldn't even process. The Americans scored first-round kills at 3,000 meters. These were ranges they had never even attempted on the training grounds. Iraqi shells fell short, kicking up harmless sand. In response, American sabot rounds punched through T-72s before the sound of the shot even reached the target. The systematic destruction of the Republican Guard's elite took exactly 40 minutes. By the end of the 2-hour engagement, the ridge was a graveyard of scorched steel. The final count confirmed the scale of the massacre. 186 tanks and 127 armored vehicles destroyed. While Iraqi divisions lost hundreds of vehicles in the dark, the crew of a single M1A1 from the 24th Infantry Division, trapped in the mud, tested the physical limits of their armor. The tank sat helpless, a massive 60-ton Predator anchored in the silt. 3 Iraqi T-72s crested a nearby ridge. The first Iraqi tank fired a heat round from less than 1,000 meters. A deafening metallic clang shook the Abrams hull. Inside, the crew felt the vibration in their teeth. The round struck the frontal armor and disintegrated. No penetration. The Abrams fired back. A depleted uranium sabot round tore through the T-72's turret, launching it into the air. The second Iraqi tank fired. Another shaped charge hit the frontal plate. Another failure. The Abrams responded with a single shot that hit the Iraqi engine, blowing the entire block out of the chassis. Then came the third T-72. It closed the distance to 400 meters. Point-blank range. It fired a kinetic energy sabot. The heavy projectile struck the M1A1HA's nose. It bounced off. It left nothing but a jagged, shallow groove in the steel. This was the reality of the heavy armor package. The frontal plate contained a mesh of depleted uranium, creating a barrier equivalent to over 600 millimeters of solid steel. For older Soviet-made shells, the tank was a ghost. It was physically impossible to kill. The third Iraqi crew realized their shells were useless. They reversed behind a sand berm, hiding from direct sight. It didn't matter. The Abrams thermal optics tracked the heat plume rising from the Iraqi exhaust behind the mound. The Americans aimed at the heat signature and fired through the earth. The round punched through the berm and shredded the T-72 on the other side. One stuck tank had dismantled a platoon. But the ordeal wasn't over. American units arrived with orders to destroy the trapped M1A1 to prevent capture. They fired twice at their own tank. Both rounds failed to penetrate. A third shot, fired from a precise angle, finally pierced the outer turret skin and ignited the stored ammunition. Black smoke billowed. But the blowout panels worked. The explosion vented upward into the sky, away from the crew compartment. The internal fire suppression system choked the flames instantly. Later, recovery vehicles pulled the hull from the mud. Mechanics inspected the damage and found the chassis intact and the electronics functional. They replaced the scorched turret and sent the same tank back into active service. This technological barrier became a physical reality before sunset. At 16:07 hours, Eagle troops struck the Iraqi flank while their defenses still faced the wrong way. 4 hours earlier, the desert was silent. Now, the machine of destruction accelerated. A Bradley commander drove directly onto an Iraqi observation bunker. 2 soldiers climbed out. They surrendered, but the alarm had already reached the village. Machine gun fire erupted from the dunes. Then came the radio call. Tanks. Direct front. 8 T-72s sat in prepared pits. They were visible to the naked eye at close range. Every single barrel pointed south. Eagle Troop had caught the brigade on its completely exposed right flank. In 60 seconds, everything in range was burning. The first defensive line turned into a wall of black smoke. Eagle Troop pushed through the fire. They found hundreds of infantry scrambling between trenches. Some raised their hands. American turrets turned away to find harder targets, but the mercy was brief. Scouts spotted Iraqis dropping their hands to reach for RPGs. The Bradleys cut them down before they could level their sights. The Iraqi commander, Mohammed, tried to deploy his reserve of 18 T-72s. They never formed a line. American crews picked them off at point-blank range as they moved. The main engagement lasted 23 minutes. Destroying 30 to 50 tanks in 23 minutes means a target exploded every 30 seconds. Along with the armor, Eagle Troop shredded 25 personnel carriers and 40 trucks. Hundreds of Iraqi infantry died in the sand. Eagle Troop reported the final tally as the sun dipped. They had 0 casualties. Not a single soldier was killed. Not one was wounded. The 0 losses of Eagle Company stood in sharp contrast to a darker reality. Elsewhere, the 2nd Brigade's statistics told a story of absolute mechanical slaughter. One side possessed the future. The other had only their positions. Specialist Clarence Cash was 20 years old. He became the only American killed during the 2nd Brigade's entire advance. His death came from a friendly tank round, not an Iraqi shell. Why did the Iraqi crews stay inside their steel coffins when the outcome was certain? The crews of the Medina Division watched their shells fall short. The dust of the desert swallowed their fire before it reached the American lines. They knew their guns could not pierce the Abrams armor. Heat built up inside the T-72s. The death of 20-year-old Clarence Cash from friendly fire was no accident. The very system that granted absolute superiority lacked a fundamental human reflex. It could not distinguish friend from foe. High-tech optics turned the battlefield into a collection of heat signatures. Through a thermal sight, every hot engine looks the same. A Bradley and a T-72 are both just white glowing shapes against the cold desert floor. At 0200 hours, Bravo Company of Task Force 141 lost contact with their battalion. They drifted into an Iraqi bunker complex. RPGs flashed in the dark. Nearby M1A1 gunners saw the sparks and the silhouettes. They didn't see allies, they saw targets. The first shell struck, then the second. Depleted uranium penetrators traveled at 1,500 meters per second. The crews had no time to reach for the radio. The rounds punched through the Bradley's armor like a needle through foil. The rear laboratory door vanished. The blast threw soldiers onto the sand. A second Bradley took a hit through the left side and out the rear. A third was crippled. The survivors scrambled out. They dropped the ramp and crawled into the dirt. They set up a circular defense and aimed their rifles at the dunes. They were certain the Iraqis had finally found them. 2 hours later, at 0400, the pattern repeated. A Bradley from Delta Company slid into a bomb crater while rounding up 20 Iraqi prisoners. American tanks spotted the movement. They fired 3 rounds. The driver died instantly. 2 of those shells passed entirely through the hull and smashed into another Bradley 20 feet away. Both vehicles began to melt into the sand. Even the Abrams wasn't safe. 1 tank survived an Iraqi RPG, only to be gutted by 3 American uranium rounds. The gunner died. The driver stumbled out, his eyes stinging and blinded by spraying diesel fuel. 4 more tanks rushed to assist. Their own side opened fire on them. The numbers reveal the cost of a site that sees too much and understands too little. 850 Iraqi tanks lay ruined across the sector. But 6 Americans were dead and 32 wounded. Most fell not to the enemy, but to their own guns. By the time the crossfire faded, the surviving crews found themselves at the center of a graveyard. 3,300 Iraqi tanks lay scorched in the sand. 2,000 armored vehicles, 2,000 artillery pieces. Burnt-out hulks stretched across the horizon for miles. American columns moved through the wreckage. They received a specific order: close all hatches. Even days after the fighting, dead Iraqi tanks continued to scream. Ammunition cooked off inside the steel, sending shrapnel whistling through the air. Inside those holes, the physics of war reached a breaking point. The temperature during a brew-up exceeds 1,000 degrees Celsius. At that heat, human fat does not burn, it melts. It liquefies and fuses into the steel floor plates. The recovery teams faced a grim mechanical task. They had to scrape charcoal remains through narrow turret openings. Veterans remember one thing above the silence: the smell. A thick, suffocating cocktail of ionized metal, diesel fuel, and roasted flesh baking in the desert sun. The scale of the erasure is absolute. Between 20,000 and 100,000 Iraqi soldiers vanished into the sand. The coalition lost 31 tanks. American casualties totaled 219 dead. 154 fell in combat. Of those, 35 were killed by their own side. Another 72 Americans were wounded by friendly rounds. The technology was so lethal, it became its own greatest threat. 20 out of 28 lost Bradleys were hit by American shells, not Iraqi ones. The final tally for the M1 Abrams remains a statistical anomaly in the history of warfare. Not a single American tank was destroyed by Iraqi fire. 0.